So to start off here, I'd like to remind you of a couple of things that I may have said to you before, depending on what you've watched, about skill. Okay, so let's take skill over here. Skill is the following things, or we can describe it the following things. First of all, it is learned. Okay, so we learn it often through practice and experience. Of course, we learn it. And we've said before that skill is based on abilities. So with that in mind, it's worth us trying to address, well, what is ability, or what are abilities? And that's why I'm going to take this word here, and we'll come to our images and our examples in a second. And I'm going to say to you that abilities are the following. Okay, so abilities are. And by the way, guys, I do expect you to be making your notes sort of roughly the same as I make, not necessarily looking the same, but make sure what goes down on my screen goes down on yours, okay? Because these are some really important concepts. So abilities are innate. Reflect on what you understand by the word innate. I'm going to say they are stable. They are stable, and guys, they are enduring. Okay, now let's just address all three of those words sort of in one go. Innate means we are born with it. Okay, stable means that it doesn't change, and enduring means it lasts our whole life. That's what we mean by abilities. They are inborn, ongoing, long-term things that don't change. Okay, so that's quite different from skill, which is influenced by practice and experience, right? So we've got some quite big differences, but what we could say is that abilities are, and I almost want to put this in quote marks, are the foundation. They are the foundation of skill. So the point what I'm trying to stress here is that according to these ideas, abilities underpin skills, but skills are ultimately learned through our experiences. Now, with that in mind, and I'm going to come back to the image in a second, I want to introduce you to three types of skill. Now, I'll link them to our performances. Okay, types of skill. And again, I really encourage you to kind of evaluate and analyze your own sports that you perform in and see how this would play out for you, for those. Okay, so I'll tell you what, let's do this nice and clean. I'm going to put a bar in here. So let's go for types of skill like this. I'm going to have a nice straight line, and I'm going to say to you that there is one type, two types, three types. Okay, so let's put this in. The first type of skill we want to be aware of is what we refer to as cognitive skills. Okay, cognitive skills. Now, cognitive skills do not include any movement whatsoever. They are simply thought-based. Okay, they are simply thought-based, and they are based around decision-making. So I'd like you to consider going up to our performances here. Which of these performances involve the most decisions? Now, you might be thinking, well, golf, you've got to choose your club, and you've got to figure out how far you are away from the green or the fairway or whatever. Yeah, that's true. But what about this performance here? This performer is having to be aware of 29 other players on the field. She's having to dodge tacklers who are coming in to take her down. She's having to consider whether runners are around her. The level of decision making, what we might call the perceptual load, is really high for this performer, okay? It's really high. So she's having to make multiple decisions. Whereas once the golfer has chosen which strike to make, or which club and which angle to hit at, it's just a repetitive action with very few decisions. So that's an interesting comparison. So we've got cognitive skills, decision making. We've also got, and by the way, these do intertwine and overlap, I should say, we've also got perceptual skills. Now, with perceptual skills, what we're talking about here is detection of information. We are talking here about interpretation of environment. Interpretation of environment. Hang on. It always helps if you spell things correctly, by the way, in life. Interpretation. And it's all about the environment, what's going on around the performer. So again, if we go back to our comparison, maybe this time of our footballers compared to our athletes, here we've got lots of perception that's required by this performer to figure out what's going on around them. Whereas our athletes, there are far fewer kind of perceptual requirements here. Yes, you have to make sure you don't tread on people's feet. Yes, you have to decide the moment to attack and overtake. Yes, you have to do those things, and you have to figure out what's going on around you. But there's far more in that game environment. So we've got different perceptual skills. And finally, guys, we have what we call motor skills. And motor skills are literally the movement. So we are talking about physical movement, and we are talking about muscular control. You know, movement comes about through obviously the contraction of muscle tissue. So that's what we understand by motor skill. Now, the only point I would make here is that many skills involve all of these. Let's sort of put a kind of a box around these. Many skills involve all of these, and I'm sure you can think of numerous. And when they involve all of them, we might refer to them as let me do it in a different color. We might refer to them as psychomotor skills. Okay, it's both perceptual, intellectual, it's movement based, the motor, but the psycho kind of brings in this perceptual and cognitive side, but it's also motor based as well. And if you break down any sport and performance, they are at heart psychomotor because they're a combination. The point is we can drill out and drill down into these different individual skills. Now, to finish off with, guys, I want to talk about somebody, and I must warn you that if you go and Google this individual, you're going to find some fairly unsavory things. I mean, they're not juicy, by the way. But if you go and Google Fleischman, Fleischman was a researcher that was based, I think from memory, around about the early 20th century, late 19th century. And he developed what's called a taxonomy, which is almost like a grouping categorization system, okay? And it was a taxonomy of motor abilities, and he recognized, or he claimed to recognize, what innate inborn abilities were. Now, the reason I'm warning you about Fleischman is that if you look at him sort of politically and ethically, he's a very, very, oh, my Skype's on. He's a very, very, very questionable individual. Okay, so I just want you to be aware of that. I am not advocating his views on the world, but from a P perspective, it's interesting to kind of reflect on what he understood by abilities. So I'm going to put them into two groups. He talked about abilities that were based around physical proficiency. Okay, so he had a group of abilities that were based around physical proficiency abilities. And he had another group of abilities that he described as perceptual motor. I mean, very much like our psychomotor concept, perceptual motor abilities. And let's see what he said about these things. So let's talk about the physical proficiency. Well, he said that people differed in their lives naturally, genetically, around how flexible they were. Okay, seems all right. Some people are born stronger than others. I mean, you might want to reflect on how reliable that is, but there we go. He argues that some people have greater levels of gross coordination than others. Now, if this is true, of course, this is going to suggest to us who's going to be more and less likely to be successful in sport. And he said some people have higher naturally occurring stamina. Now, we can look at hematocrit and red blood cell count, and we can say, okay, there seems to be some foundation for that. And he also broke things down into perceptual much. Remember, perceptual is interpretation and detection. And he said these were that people were different because they have different processing and therefore reaction time. He said that they had different levels of manual dexterity. And what he meant by that was the ability to put body parts into the correct positions. He argued that some people naturally had faster and slower wrist and finger speed. I mean, it gets very interesting, right? It gets very specific. And let's look at the wording of this one. He talked about distinctions in people from posture, what he referred to as posture discrimination. Now, bearing in mind who this person was politically, this word at the bottom is not an uninteresting word. And can I repeat again that I'm teaching about Fleischman not because of his politics, not because of his view on the world, but because he's interesting to us, because he described what maybe the idea of abilities were, and therefore we can look at that in relation to skill. Cheers, guys.